Welcome to the Sleepy Storyteller. Tonight's story will take you on a journey through Abraham Lincoln's mysterious dream. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and drift away. Let's begin. Abraham Lincoln's Eerie Dream Before the Theater Chapter 1. The Weight of Victory. The gaslight flickered against the walls of the executive mansion, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the restless thoughts of the man who sat hunched over his desk. Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, pressed his long fingers against his temples, feeling the familiar ache that had become his constant companion these past 4 years. It was April 14th, 1865, Good Friday. The war that had torn the nation asunder was finally, mercifully, coming to an end. Just 5 days prior, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Confederate resistance. The Union was preserved, the slaves were free, and yet Lincoln found no peace in his heart. Mary had retired hours ago, her gentle breathing now a soft whisper from their bedroom. She had been so pleased earlier that evening, chattering excitedly about their planned visit to Ford's Theater. Our American cousin, she had said, her eyes bright with anticipation. They say it's quite amusing, Abraham. When was the last time we laughed together? When indeed, Lincoln could not recall. The weight of 600,000 dead Americans pressed upon his shoulders like a shroud. Every night he saw their faces in his dreams, young men from farms in Illinois, from factories in Massachusetts, from plantations in Georgia, Union blue and Confederate gray, all reduced to the same pale silence. He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. At 56, he felt ancient, as if the years of war had aged him decades. His reflection in the window showed a man worn thin by responsibility, his famous beard now streaked with silver, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. The executive mansion was quiet around him, save for the soft footsteps of the night watchman making his rounds. Lincoln had grown accustomed to these midnight hours of solitude. Sleep came reluctantly, if at all, and when it did, it brought with it visions that left him more exhausted than wakefulness. He moved to his private study, where the embers of an earlier fire still glowed faintly in the hearth. The room smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, familiar scents that usually brought him comfort. Tonight, however, even these small pleasures felt distant, as if he were experiencing them through a thick pane of glass. On his desk lay a stack of documents requiring his signature pardons, mostly for Confederate soldiers and sympathizers. His policy of malice toward none had created a mountain of paperwork, but Lincoln signed each one carefully, considering the life and family behind every name. Mercy, he had learned, was harder work than vengeance. As he reached for his pen, a strange sensation washed over him, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere, carrying with it the scent of something he could not quite identify. It was sweet, yet somehow corrupted, like flowers left too long in standing water. He looked up, expecting to see a window left ajar, but all were tightly closed against the April night. The feeling passed, leaving him with an inexplicable sense of unease. He had experienced such moments before, particularly in recent weeks. Mary called them his spells, though he preferred not to name them at all. They were simply part of his existence now, like the headaches and the insomnia unwelcome companions in his journey. Through these final days of war, he forced himself to focus on the document before him, a pardon for a young Confederate captain, captured in the final days of fighting. The boy was barely 20, with a wife and newborn child in Alabama. Lincoln signed his name with a flourish, imagining the reunion that would soon follow. Perhaps some good could still come from all this. Suffering. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the room before settling back into glowing embers. In that moment of brightness, Lincoln could have sworn he saw a figure standing in the corner, tall, dark, watching him with eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and warning. He blinked, and the corner was empty. "Getting old, Abraham," he murmured to himself, though he knew it was more than age that plagued him. The war had opened doorways in his mind that he could not seem to close, pathways through which strange dreams and stranger waking visions seemed to flow. He had always been a rational man, a lawyer who dealt in facts and evidence, yet increasingly, he found himself in the grip of premonitions and portents that defied logical explanation. Only a week ago, he had dreamed of walking through the executive mansion, following the sound of weeping. In his dream, he had found a catafalque in the East Room, surrounded by mourners in black. When he asked a soldier who lay within, the man had replied, "The president." He was killed by an assassin. Lincoln had awakened in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had not shared this dream with Mary, knowing it would only add to her already considerable anxieties. She worried constantly about his safety, pleading with him to increase his security, to avoid public appearances. But he could not lead from behind walls of fear. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight, its deep bronze voice echoing through the silent rooms. Lincoln set down his pen and rubbed his eyes, feeling the familiar burn of fatigue. Perhaps tonight sleep would come more easily. Perhaps tonight the dreams would be kind. He gathered the signed documents into a neat stack and secured them with a paperweight, a small bronze eagle that had been a gift from the people of Illinois. As he prepared to extinguish the desk lamp, another wave of that strange cold passed over him, stronger this time, accompanied by a sound like distant music. Lincoln froze, listening intently. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, played on what sounded like a violin, though he could not identify the piece. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with its melancholy sweetness. As he listened, the music began to change, becoming more discordant, more urgent, until it resembled not a song but a warning cry. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. Lincoln stood in the sudden silence, his heart racing. He had heard phantom music before, usually just before falling asleep, but never with such clarity, such emotional intensity. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkened streets of Washington. Gas lamps flickered like stars along the avenues, but the city lay peaceful under the spring night sky. What was happening to him? Was this the toll of leadership, the price of carrying a nation's grief? Or was something else at work, something beyond his understanding? He had always been a spiritual man, though not conventionally religious. His faith was a complex thing, shaped by loss and tempered by the harsh realities of governance. He believed in providence and some grand design that human minds could not fully grasp, but he also believed in the power of the human spirit to shape its own destiny. Now, however, he felt caught between two worlds, the rational realm of politics and policy, and this other place where dreams and reality seemed to blur together. It was as if the approaching end of the war had somehow thinned the veil between the seen and unseen, allowing glimpses of things that were normally hidden. Lincoln returned to his desk and pulled out a sheet of his personal stationery. Perhaps writing would help him make sense of these strange experiences. He dated the letter April 14th, 1865, and began to write, "My dear friend, I find myself in a peculiar state of mind as I write these words. The war draws to its close, and yet I feel no peace. Instead, I am beset by visions and dreams that seem to speak of things to come. I have always trusted in reason and evidence, but these experiences test the boundaries of rational thought. Tonight, I heard music that came from no earthly source, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. It spoke to something deep within my soul, something that recognizes truth even when the mind cannot comprehend it. I fear I am being prepared for something, though I cannot say what Mary wishes us to attend the theater tomorrow evening. She has been so patient with my moods, so understanding of the burdens I carry. I have promised to take her, though I confess I would prefer the quiet of home. Yet perhaps laughter is what we both need, a reminder that joy still exists in this world despite all the sorrow we have witnessed. I pray that when you read this, you will find me in good health and spirits. But if something should happen to me, know that I have tried to serve with honor and to heal the wounds that have divided our nation. The work is not finished, but it is begun, and that must be enough. Lincoln paused, reading over what he had written. The words seemed to have come from somewhere deep within him, expressing fears and hopes he had not even known he harbored. He had begun the letter intending to address it to his old friend Joshua Speed, but now he was not sure he would ever send it. Instead, he folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. Perhaps someday, when these strange experiences had passed, he would look back on this night and laugh at his own foolishness. But for now, the letter would remain his secret, a record of this moment when the future seemed to press against the present with almost physical weight. The clock chimed midnight, and Lincoln finally admitted defeat in his battle against sleep. He extinguished the lamp and made his way quietly through the darkened mansion, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, he paused at the landing window and looked out once more at the peaceful city. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new weights to bear. But tonight he would rest, and perhaps in sleep, he would find the peace that eluded him in waking hours. As he reached for the handle of his bedroom door, Lincoln thought. He heard very faintly the sound of that phantom music beginning again. This time, however, it did not frighten him. Instead, it seemed almost like a lullaby, gentle and soothing, as if some unseen presence were trying to comfort him. He smiled slightly and entered his room, where Mary lay sleeping peacefully in their bed. Her face, relaxed in slumber, looked years younger, reminding him of the woman he had married more than 2 decades ago. Whatever troubles the future might hold, he was grateful for this moment of quiet companionship. Lincoln changed into his nightclothes and slipped carefully into bed, trying not to disturb his wife. As he settled against the pillows, he felt the familiar tension in his muscles beginning to ease. The phantom music continued, so soft now that he could barely hear it, like a whisper of wind through distant trees. For the first time in weeks, Abraham Lincoln felt himself drifting peacefully towards sleep, unaware that his dreams would soon carry him to places darker and more prophetic than he had ever imagined. Chapter 2. The Descent. Into dream sleep came to Abraham Lincoln like a gentle tide, carrying him away from the concerns of the waking world into the mysterious realm of dreams. At first, he floated in peaceful darkness, his mind finally released from the constant weight of presidential duties. The phantom music he had heard earlier seemed to follow him into sleep, becoming a distant lullaby that soothed his troubled spirit. But as the night deepened, the music began to change, becoming more complex, more urgent. The gentle melody transformed into something that seemed to pull at his very soul, drawing him deeper into the landscape of dream. Lincoln found himself walking through a vast, empty theater, its red velvet seats stretching endlessly in all directions. The theater was unlike any he had ever seen. The architecture seemed to shift and flow, walls breathing like living things, ornate decorations morphing from gold to silver to something that was not quite either. Above him, a magnificent chandelier hung suspended in space, its crystals chiming softly with each movement of air, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and somehow ominous. Lincoln walked down the center aisle, his footsteps muffled by a carpet that seemed to absorb all sound. He was dressed not in his nightclothes, but in his finest black suit, the one he wore to formal state occasions. In his hand, he carried his top hat, though he could not remember picking it up. As he approached the stage, he noticed that the theater was not entirely empty. Shadowy figures occupied some of the seats, their faces obscured by darkness. They sat motionless, as if waiting for a performance that had not yet begun. Lincoln tried to see them more clearly, but the harder he looked, the more they seemed to fade into the shadows. The stage itself was bathed in an ethereal light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Heavy curtains of deep crimson hung at the sides, and Lincoln could hear voices coming from behind them, familiar voices, though he could not quite place them. "The performance is about to begin," said a voice behind him. Lincoln turned to see a figure approaching through the theater aisle. It was a man of middle years, well-dressed in evening clothes, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. There was something familiar about him, though Lincoln was certain they had never met. "What performance?" Lincoln asked, though his voice seemed to come from very far away. "The one you have been preparing for all your life," the man replied. "Every choice you have made, every word you have spoken, every decision you have rendered, all have been leading to this moment." Lincoln felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the dream theater. "I don't understand. Who are you?" The man smiled sadly. "I am someone who has walked this path before you. Someone who knows what it means to serve a cause greater than oneself, even unto death." Before Lincoln could respond, the curtains on the stage began to part, revealing a scene that made his blood run cold. The stage had become the executive mansion's East Room, exactly as he had seen it in his earlier dream. A catafalque stood in the center, draped in black cloth, surrounded by mourners in dark clothing. The sound of weeping filled the air, soft but heartbreaking. "No," Lincoln whispered, backing away from the stage. "This is just a dream. This is not real, is it not?" the mysterious figure asked. "Or is it perhaps more real than the waking world? You know, dreams have their own truth, Mr. President. They show us not what is, but what may be, what must be, what already is in the realm of possibility." Lincoln watched in horror as the scene on the stage began to move. The mourners turned their faces toward him, and he recognized many of them: Mary, his son Robert, members of his cabinet, friends and colleagues from his years in politics. All were dressed in funeral black. All wore expressions of profound grief. "Why are you showing me this?" Lincoln demanded, though his voice cracked with emotion. "Because you need to understand," the figure replied. "Your life has been a preparation for this moment. Every loss you have endured, every challenge you have faced, every decision you have made, all have been preparing you for what is to come." The scene on the stage shifted, and Lincoln saw himself as a young man splitting rails on his father's farm in Illinois. The work was hard, but there was joy in it, satisfaction in the simple act of creating something useful with his own hands. He watched his younger self pause in his work, gazing up at the sky with dreams of something greater burning in his eyes. "Even then," the figure said softly, "you knew you were destined for more than the life you were born to. You felt it in your bones, didn't you? The call to serve, to lead, to sacrifice for something greater than yourself." The scene changed again, showing Lincoln as a young lawyer standing before a jury in a small courthouse. He was defending a man accused of murder, using his gift for storytelling and his deep understanding of human nature to convince 12 men of his client's innocence. The passion in his voice, the conviction in his bearing, these were the qualities that would later make him a great leader. "You have always been a man of the people," the figure observed. "You understand suffering because you have suffered. You understand loss because you have lost. You understand the weight of responsibility because you have carried it all your life. Lincoln found himself drawn into the unfolding drama on the stage, watching his life replay in scenes both familiar and strange. He saw himself as a young politician speaking passionately against the expansion of slavery. He saw himself debating Stephen Douglas, his tall frame bent over the podium as he argued for the principles that would define his presidency. "The house divided against itself cannot stand," he heard his younger self say, and the words echoed through the dream theater like a prophecy. The scene shifted to show his election as president, the joy and hope of that moment quickly overshadowed by the gathering clouds of war. Lincoln watched himself struggle with the decisions that would define his legacy, whether to resupply Fort Sumter, whether to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, whether to continue fighting when the cost in human lives seemed unbearable. "You have carried the weight of a nation," the figure said, his voice filled with compassion. "You have made decisions that would break lesser men. You have held the Union together through sheer force of will and moral conviction. But every great leader must eventually face the ultimate test." "What test?" Lincoln asked, though he feared. He already knew the answer. Before the figure could respond, the stage erupted in chaos. The peaceful scene of the East Room dissolved into something far more violent and immediate. Lincoln found himself watching what appeared to be a theater box, elegantly appointed with red velvet chairs and gold trim. A familiar figure sat in one of the chairs, watching a performance below with obvious pleasure. With a shock, Lincoln realized he was looking at himself, but not as he appeared in the dream. This was his physical self, his waking self, as he would appear tomorrow evening at Ford's Theater. Mary sat beside him, beautiful in her evening gown, laughing at something happening on the stage below. "No," Lincoln breathed, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "This is tomorrow night. This is the culmination," the figure said quietly. "The moment when your earthly service ends and your eternal legacy begins." Lincoln watched in horror as a dark figure appeared at the back of the theater box. The man was young, handsome in a theatrical way, with wild eyes and a pistol in his hand. He moved with the fluid grace of an actor, which indeed he was John Wilkes Booth, a name that would forever be linked with infamy. "Stop this," Lincoln commanded, but his voice seemed to have no power in this dream realm. "Stop this now. I command you." "You cannot command fate," the figure replied sadly. "You can only choose how you will meet it, with fear or with courage, with regret or with acceptance, with despair or with hope for what your sacrifice will accomplish." The scene unfolded with terrible inevitability. Lincoln watched himself lean forward in the theater box, pointing at something amusing on the stage. Mary laughed beside him, her face radiant with happiness. It was perhaps the most relaxed and joyful he had seen her in years. Then Booth raised his pistol and Lincoln saw the finger tighten on the trigger. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each second stretching into an eternity. He could see the tiny flame that would soon erupt from the barrel, could almost hear the explosion that would echo through history. "Why?" Lincoln cried out, his voice breaking with anguish. "Why must it end this way? I have so much more to do. The reconstruction, the healing of the nation, the integration of the freed slaves. There is so much work left undone." The mysterious figure placed a gentle hand on Lincoln's shoulder. "Your work will be completed, but not by you. Sometimes a man serves his country best in death, when his sacrifice becomes a symbol that inspires others to carry on the work he began." Lincoln felt tears streaming down his face as he watched the scene play out. The pistol fired, the sound echoing through the theater like thunder. He saw himself slumped forward in the chair, saw Mary's face transform from joy to horror, saw the chaos that erupted as the reality of what had happened sank in. Your death will accomplish what your life could not, the figure continued. It will unite the nation in grief and purpose. It will make the cause of freedom and equality sacred in a way that no living man could achieve. You will become more than a president. You will become a martyr, a symbol, a saint. The scene on the stage shifted again, showing Lincoln events that would unfold in the years and decades following his death. He saw the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the settlement of the West, the industrial transformation of the nation. He saw former slaves becoming citizens, then voters, then leaders. He saw his own image carved into the side of Mount Rushmore, his words inscribed in marble at a magnificent memorial in the nation's capital. This is what your sacrifice will purchase, the figure explained. Not just the preservation of the Union, but the birth of a new America, one that truly embodies the principles you have fought to defend. Your death will be the seed from which a greater nation grows. Lincoln wiped the tears from his eyes, struggling to understand what he was being shown. But the suffering, he whispered, the pain it will cause Mary, my sons, the people who depend on me. Yes, the figure acknowledged. There will be great suffering. Mary will never fully recover from the loss. Your son Robert will carry the burden of being the martyred president's son for the rest of his life. The nation will mourn as it has never mourned before. The figure paused, his expression growing even more compassionate. But grief, when it is shared, becomes something greater than individual pain. It becomes a force for unity, for healing, for transformation. Your death will teach the nation that some things are worth dying for, that freedom. Equality and justice are not merely political concepts, but sacred principles worth any sacrifice. Lincoln looked again at the stage, where the scene had changed. Once more, now he saw his own funeral, the magnificent procession that would carry his body from Washington to Springfield. Millions of Americans lined the railroad tracks, all races and classes united in grief. He saw grown men weeping openly, children holding flowers, former slaves singing hymns of mourning and gratitude. They understand, the figure said softly. In your death, they finally understand what you lived for, what you died for. They see that your sacrifice was not in vain, that it was the price of their freedom, their unity, their future. Lincoln felt his resistance beginning to crumble. The logic of sacrifice, the nobility of giving one's life for a cause greater than oneself, these were concepts he had always understood intellectually. Now he was being asked to embrace them personally, to accept that his own death would serve a purpose beyond his comprehension. If this is truly necessary, he said slowly, if this is the price that must be paid for the nation's healing, then I will pay it. But I need to know, will my death truly serve the cause of justice? Will it help create the America I have dreamed of? The figure smiled, and for the first time, Lincoln saw hope in his eyes. Your death will be remembered as one of the most significant moments in American history. It will inspire generations of leaders to follow your example of service and sacrifice. It will remind the nation, whenever it faces dark times, that there are people willing to give everything for the principles they hold dear. As the figure spoke, the scene on the stage began to fade, the theater itself becoming insubstantial. Lincoln found himself standing in a place that was neither fully dark nor fully light, a realm between sleeping and waking where truth could be spoken without the barriers of ordinary reality. I am not ready, Lincoln admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I am not ready to leave Mary, to leave my work unfinished, to leave the nation in such a fragile state. No one is ever ready, the figure replied. Readiness is not what is required. Only courage, only faith, only the willingness to trust that your sacrifice will serve a purpose greater than your own desires. Lincoln felt the weight of destiny settling upon him like a mantle. Throughout his life, he had believed in providence and the idea that there was a greater plan at work in the affairs of men. Now he was being asked to place his ultimate trust in that plan, even though it required the greatest sacrifice he could imagine. How do I find the strength? He asked. The same way you have always found it, the figure replied. Through your love for the people you serve, through your commitment to the principles you hold dear, through your faith that justice and righteousness will ultimately prevail. The dream theater began to dissolve around them, the red velvet seats fading into mist, the golden chandelier becoming nothing more than points of light in the darkness. Lincoln felt himself being pulled back toward waking, but the figure's words followed him like an echo. Remember, the voice said, growing fainter as the dream ended, your death will not be an ending but a beginning. Your sacrifice will plant seeds that will grow into a harvest of freedom and justice for generations to come. Lincoln struggled to hold on to the dream, to understand fully what he had been shown, but already the details were beginning to blur and fade. He was left with emotions rather than clear memories, a sense of profound sadness mingled with an odd kind of peace, a fear of what was to come tempered by an understanding of its necessity. As consciousness began to return, Lincoln found himself thinking not of his own fate, but of the nation he loved. If his death could truly serve the cause of freedom and justice, if it could help heal the wounds of war and create a more perfect union, then perhaps it was a price worth paying. But even as he accepted this possibility, his heart ached for all that he would leave behind: his beloved Mary, his sons, the great work of reconstruction that he had only just begun. The weight of impending loss pressed down upon him like a physical thing, making each breath a struggle. Yet beneath the grief, there was something else, a strange sense of purpose, of destiny fulfilled. He had always believed that he had been called to serve in this great crisis of the nation's history. Now he was beginning to understand that his service might require the ultimate sacrifice. As the dream faded completely and Lincoln drifted toward deeper sleep, he carried with him the echo of that mysterious figure's words. Your death will not be an ending, but a beginning. Chapter 3. Visions of tomorrow. As Lincoln sank deeper into sleep, the dream realm shifted once again, taking on new dimensions and meanings. He found himself standing in a vast library, its shelves stretching impossibly high into misty darkness above. The books seemed to glow with their own internal light, and as he moved closer, he could see that their covers bore dates, not just from the past, but from the future. 1870, 1880, 1900, 1950, 2000, the books of the future called to him. And with the logic of dreams, Lincoln found he could simply reach out and open them, their pages revealing scenes from the America that would come after his death. The first book he opened showed him the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, that great iron thread that would bind the nation together from sea to shining sea. He watched as the last spike was driven at Promontory Point, Utah, and felt a surge of pride that this dream of connection had been realized. But as he turned the pages, he saw darker truths as well. The years immediately following his death would be marked by struggle and betrayal. The generous Reconstruction policies he had envisioned would be abandoned, replaced by harsh measures that would create new divisions and resentments. The freed slaves, whom he had hoped to see integrated into American society as full citizens, would instead face a new form of bondage, segregation, discrimination, and violence that would persist for generations. This is not what I intended, Lincoln whispered to the empty library, his voice echoing among the towering shelves. A new figure appeared beside him, an elderly black man in simple clothes, his face bearing the marks of hard labor and harder times. There was dignity in his bearing and wisdom in his eyes that spoke of struggles endured and overcome. Intentions and outcomes, the man said quietly, are not always the same thing, but that doesn't mean the intentions were worthless. Lincoln studied the man's face, recognizing in it the features of countless former slaves he had met during his presidency. "Who are you?" "I am everyone who was set free by your proclamation," the man replied. "Everyone who lived to see a new dawn because of your courage. Everyone who died before that dawn could fully break, but died knowing that it was coming." Lincoln felt the weight of responsibility settling upon him even more heavily. "But look at what happens," he said, gesturing to the pages of the future books. "Look at the suffering that continues, the promises that are broken, the hopes that are deferred." The man nodded slowly. "Yes, there is suffering, there is betrayal. There are setbacks and disappointments. But look more closely, Mr. President. Look at the whole story." Lincoln turned the pages further, and gradually he began to see the larger pattern. The years of oppression and struggle were real, but so was the slow, steady progress toward justice. He saw the founding of schools and colleges for freed slaves, the emergence of Black leaders in politics and business, the gradual expansion of civil rights. He saw a young Black woman named Rosa Parks refusing to give up her bus seat, sparking a movement that would transform the nation. He saw a preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, declaring his dream of racial equality to hundreds of thousands of Americans, both Black and white. "I have a dream," the future preacher proclaimed in the vision, "that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Lincoln felt tears streaming down his face as he watched this scene unfold. The great memorial built in his honor had become a platform for the very ideals he had fought to defend. His sacrifice had indeed planted seeds, and those seeds were growing into a harvest of freedom and justice. "You see," the elderly man said gently, "your death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Every step forward, every victory for justice, every moment when Americans chose to be better than they were, all of these things trace back to the choice you made, the sacrifice you were willing to make." Lincoln turned more pages, seeing the America of the 20th century unfold before him. He saw the nation rise to meet the challenge of 2 world wars, saw it emerge as a beacon of freedom and democracy to the world. He saw the space program that would put Americans on the moon, the civil rights movement that would finally fulfill the promise of equality, the technological innovations that would transform human life. But he also saw the continued struggles, the Great Depression, the wars in Vietnam and Iraq, the persistent inequalities that would plague American society. The future America was not perfect, but it was striving to be better, always reaching toward those ideals he had articulated in his greatest speeches. "The work is never finished," the elderly man observed. "Each generation must choose anew whether to honor the principles you died for or to abandon them for easier paths. But your example continues to inspire them to choose the harder but more righteous way." Lincoln closed the book and looked around the mystical library. Thousands of volumes surrounded him, each one representing a different aspect of the American story. He realized that his own life and death were just one chapter in a much larger narrative, a story that would continue long after he was gone. "I begin to understand," he said slowly. "My death is not just about ending the war or preserving the Union. It is about creating a symbol, a standard by which future generations can measure their own commitment to justice and equality." The elderly man smiled. "Now you begin to see the true scope of your sacrifice. Your death will echo through history, reminding Americans of their highest ideals whenever they are tempted to abandon them." The library began to fade around them, but Lincoln found himself transported to another scene, a classroom in the future, where a young teacher was explaining the significance of the Civil War to a group of students. On the blackboard, she had written Lincoln's words from the Gettysburg Address, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people by the people. For the people shall not perish from the earth. Mr. Lincoln understood the teacher was saying that democracy is not just a form of government, but a sacred trust. Each generation must prove itself worthy of the sacrifices made by those who came before. Lincoln watched as the students, boys and girls of different races and backgrounds, listened intently to the lesson. In their young faces, he saw the future of the nation, the living embodiment of the ideals he had fought to preserve. One student, a young girl with bright eyes and a questioning expression, raised her hand. But why did he have to die? Couldn't he have done more good by living? The teacher paused, considering the question carefully. Sometimes, she said finally, a person's death becomes more powerful than their life. Lincoln's assassination made him a martyr for the cause of freedom and equality. It reminded the nation that these ideals are worth dying for, and therefore worth living for. Lincoln felt a deep peace settling over him as he listened to these words. The teacher understood the students would carry the message forward. His death would not be in vain. The scene shifted once more, and Lincoln found himself standing in a great cathedral, its soaring arches and stained glass windows creating an atmosphere of profound reverence. But this was no ordinary cathedral. It was built entirely from light. Its walls and pillars, seeming to pulse with spiritual energy, at the altar stood a figure robed in white, his face obscured by a radiance that was both beautiful and terrible. Lincoln felt compelled to approach, though every step required tremendous effort, as if he were walking through deep water. "You have seen the future," the figure said, his voice resonating through the cathedral like music. "You have seen the consequences of your choice. Now you must decide, will you embrace your destiny or will you try to change it?" Lincoln stood before the altar, feeling the weight of the entire nation's future resting upon his shoulders. He thought of Mary, sleeping peacefully beside him in the executive mansion. He thought of his son Robert, just beginning his adult life. He thought of all the unfinished work awaiting him, the reconstruction of the South, the integration of the freed slaves, the healing of the nation's wounds. "If I could change it," he said slowly, "if I could avoid this fate and continue to serve the nation in life rather than death, would that not be better?" The figure remained silent for a long moment, and Lincoln felt the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Finally, the radiant being spoke again. "Consider this. If you were to live, what would you accomplish? You would oversee the reconstruction of the South, yes, but your policies would be opposed by those who seek revenge rather than reconciliation. You would work to integrate the freed slaves into American society, but you would face resistance from those who believe in white supremacy. You would try to heal the nation's wounds, but many would prefer to keep them open, to nurture their grievances rather than seek forgiveness." Lincoln felt the truth of these words like a physical blow. He had already seen the resistance to his moderate policies, the calls for harsh punishment of the South, the reluctance of many to embrace true equality for the freed slaves. His living presidency would be marked by compromise and frustration, by partial victories and bitter defeats. But in death, the figure continued, "You become something more than a politician struggling with the messy realities of governance. You become a symbol of sacrifice, a reminder of what Americans can aspire to be. Your words, freed from the constraints of political necessity, become scripture for future generations seeking guidance in their own struggles for justice." The cathedral began to fill with ghostly figures, all the Americans who would die in the centuries to come defending the principles Lincoln had articulated. Soldiers in 2 world wars, civil rights activists facing down hatred and violence, ordinary citizens standing up for what was right even when it cost them everything. Each of these people, the figure said, draws strength from your example. Your willingness to die for the cause of freedom and equality gives them the courage to risk their own lives for the same ideals. This is the true power of martyrdom, not just the sacrifice itself, but the inspiration it provides to others. Lincoln watched as the ghostly figures began to sing not words, but a harmony that seemed to encompass all human emotion. Joy and sorrow, hope and despair, love and loss, all were woven together into a tapestry of sound that spoke to the deepest parts of his soul. "I understand now," Lincoln whispered, his voice barely audible above the celestial chorus. "My death is not just about ending my own story. It is about beginning countless others. Every person who finds the courage to stand up for justice, every individual who chooses principle over convenience, every soul who refuses to accept injustice, all of them are carrying forward the work I began." The figure at the altar nodded slowly. "You are beginning to grasp the true nature of leadership. The greatest leaders are not those who accumulate power or achieve earthly success. They are those who plant seeds of truth and justice that will grow long after they are gone. Your death will be such a seed, small in itself, but capable of growing into a mighty tree that will shelter generations of Americans seeking freedom and equality." The cathedral began to fade, but Lincoln found himself in one more scene, a simple log cabin, much like the one where he had been born. But this cabin existed outside of time, serving as a meeting place for all the great leaders and martyrs of American history. He saw George Washington, the father of the country, sitting quietly in one corner. Thomas Jefferson was there, as was Benjamin Franklin, their faces marked by the wisdom that comes from serving something greater than oneself. But he also saw figures from the future, the civil rights leaders who would carry forward his work, the politicians who would invoke his name in their struggles for justice, the ordinary citizens who would find in his example the courage to do extraordinary things. "Welcome," said a voice, and Lincoln turned to see a young woman approaching him. She was beautiful, with the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility and sacrifice. "I am someone who will come after you, someone who will draw strength from your example when the time comes to face my own moment of testing." Lincoln studied her face, seeing in it the qualities he had always admired: intelligence, compassion, determination, and an unwavering commitment to principle. "Who are you?" "I am every leader who will face the choice between personal safety and public service," she replied. "I am every person who will risk everything for the cause of justice. I am every soul who will choose the harder path because it is the right path." She gestured to the other figures in the cabin. "We are all connected, Mr. President. Your sacrifice makes our sacrifices possible. Your courage gives us courage. Your willingness to die for your principles reminds us that there are things worth dying for." Lincoln felt a profound sense of completion settling over him. He had always believed that his life had meaning, that his service as president was part of some greater design. Now he understood that his death would be equally meaningful, equally important to the unfolding story of American freedom and democracy. But what about Mary? He asked, the personal cost of his sacrifice still weighing heavily on his heart. "What about my family? What about all the people who depend on me?" The young woman's expression grew infinitely compassionate. "Their suffering will be real and terrible," she acknowledged, "but it will not be meaningless. Mary's grief will touch the hearts of millions of Americans, reminding them of the human cost of freedom. Your sons will carry forward your legacy, ensuring that your ideals survive and prosper. And the people who depend on you, they will find that your death has given them something even more valuable than your living presence. It has given them a cause worth living for. Lincoln looked around the cabin one more time, seeing in the faces of America's greatest leaders the same combination of sorrow and determination that he felt in his own heart. They had all faced moments like this, times when they had to choose between personal desires and public duty, between safety and service, between life and legacy. "I am ready," he said simply, and as he spoke the words, he felt a great weight lifting from his shoulders. The fear was still there, the grief for all he would leave behind, but they were overshadowed by a sense of purpose and destiny that filled him with unexpected peace. The cabin began to fade, and Lincoln found himself drifting back toward waking consciousness. But as he rose through the layers of sleep, he carried with him the visions he had seen, the understanding he had gained, and the acceptance he had found. His death would not be an ending, but a transformation. His sacrifice would plant seeds that would grow for generations. His legacy would inspire countless others to choose courage over comfort, principle over popularity, service over safety. As the dream finally released its hold on him, Lincoln felt himself returning to his body, to the bedroom where Mary lay sleeping beside him. But he was no longer the same man who had fallen asleep hours earlier. He had been changed by what he had seen, prepared for what was to come, and filled with a strange new peace about his destiny. The clock on the bedside table showed nearly dawn, and Lincoln knew that this would be his last full day on Earth. Tomorrow evening, he would accompany Mary to Ford's Theater, where John Wilkes Booth would be waiting with his pistol and his twisted sense of justice. But Lincoln was no longer afraid. He understood now that his death would serve a purpose greater than his own life, that his sacrifice would echo through history, inspiring generations of Americans to strive for the ideals he had articulated and died to defend. Chapter 4. The weight of knowing Abraham Lincoln awoke to the soft gray light of dawn, filtering through the bedroom curtains. For a moment, he lay perfectly still, caught between the fading remnants of his extraordinary dream and the harsh reality of the waking world. The visions were already beginning to blur around the edges, as dreams do, but their emotional impact remained as sharp and clear as if they had been lived rather than dreamed. Beside him, Mary stirred gently in her sleep, her face peaceful in the early morning light. Lincoln studied her features, the soft curve of her cheek, the way her dark hair fell across the pillow, the slight smile that sometimes played at the corners of her mouth, even in sleep. How many more hours would he have to memorize these details? How many more moments to treasure her presence beside him? The knowledge of what was to come sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. He had always been a rational man, quick to dismiss superstition and unexplained phenomena. But the dream he had just experienced felt different from any he had known before. It carried with it a weight of truth that his logical mind found difficult to dismiss. Lincoln slipped quietly from the bed, careful not to wake Mary, and moved to the window. The city of Washington was beginning to stir below early risers heading to work, vendors setting up their stalls, the rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestone streets. It was a scene he had observed countless times during his presidency, but this morning it felt different, more precious somehow, as if he were seeing it for the last time. The weight of the dream pressed down upon him as he watched the city come alive. The mysterious figure who had guided him through the visions, the library of future books, the cathedral of light, all of it seemed more real than the physical world around him. And the message had been clear. His death would serve a purpose greater than his life, planting seeds of justice and equality that would grow for generations. But knowledge and acceptance were two different things. Even as his mind grappled with the logic of sacrifice, his heart rebelled against the thought of leaving Mary, of abandoning the great work of reconstruction, of never seeing his grandchildren grow up. The personal cost of destiny was almost more than he could bear, A soft knock at the bedroom door interrupted his brooding. "Mr. President," came the voice of his valet, Thomas. "Your coffee is ready, sir." "Thank you, Thomas. I'll be down presently." Lincoln dressed slowly, each familiar routine taking on new significance. The simple act of buttoning his shirt, of adjusting his collar, of selecting his tie, all seemed charged with meaning now that he understood these might be among his last such moments. His hands trembled slightly as he completed his morning ablutions, not from fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of impending Lestat as he prepared to leave the bedroom. Lincoln paused at Mary's dressing table, where her jewelry box sat open, revealing the small treasures she had accumulated over their years together. A cameo brooch he had given her for their 10th anniversary, a pearl necklace inherited from her mother, a simple gold locket containing a photograph of their son Willie, lost to typhoid fever 3 years earlier. The thought of Willie brought a fresh wave of grief. Their boy had been so young, so full of life and promise. Lincoln had often wondered if Willie's death had been some kind of preparation for the other losses that would follow. Now, facing his own mortality, he felt a strange comfort in the thought that he might soon be reunited with his lost son. He reached out and touched the locket gently, remembering Willie's laughter, his insatiable curiosity, his boundless energy. If Lincoln's death was indeed part of some greater design, perhaps it would also serve to heal the wounds that Willie's passing had left in their family. Perhaps there was mercy even in tragedy. Lincoln made his way downstairs to his study, where Thomas had indeed prepared his coffee and laid out the morning newspapers. The headline spoke of victory and celebration. "Lee surrenders. The war is over. Union preserved." But Lincoln found himself unable to take joy in these proclamations. How could he celebrate victory when he knew it would be so short-lived? When he understood that the greater struggle for justice and equality was only just beginning? He picked up one of the newspapers and tried to read, but the words seemed to swim before his eyes. Instead, he found himself thinking about the young teacher he had seen in his dream, explaining to her students the significance of sacrifice. Would future generations understand why he had to die? Would they see his assassination as a necessary chapter in the American story, or would they view it as a senseless tragedy that could have been prevented? The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Mary's awakening. Lincoln quickly composed himself, arranging his features into an expression of calm attentiveness. He could not burden her with the knowledge of what was to come. If his death was indeed inevitable, at least he could spare her the agony of anticipation. "Good morning, my dear," Mary said as she entered the study, already dressed in her morning gown. Her face was bright with happiness, the kind of joy Lincoln had not seen in her for months. "Isn't it wonderful? The war is finally over. We can begin to rebuild, to heal, to become a family again." Lincoln rose and embraced her, holding her perhaps a moment longer than usual. "Yes," he agreed, his voice carefully controlled. "It is wonderful. The nation can finally begin to heal." Mary pulled back slightly, studying his face with the keen perception of a wife who had lived through 4 years of war beside her husband. "You seem troubled, Abraham. Are you not happy that the fighting has ended?" "I am happy," Lincoln replied, and it was not entirely a lie. He was happy that the war was over, that the killing had stopped, that the Union was preserved. But happiness and sorrow could coexist in the human heart, and his was filled with both. "Perhaps I am simply tired. The weight of these years has been considerable." Mary's expression soft with understanding. "Of course you are tired. You have carried the burden of the entire nation on your shoulders. But now you can rest, at least a little. We can have some time together, just the two of us." The irony of her words was almost unbearable. They would indeed have time together, precisely one more day. Lincoln forced himself to smile, to participate. in the moment of joy she was experiencing. Yes, we can have time together. In fact, I believe we have plans for this evening. Mary's face lit up with delight. Ford's Theater. I'm so looking forward to it, Abraham. Our American cousin is supposed to be quite amusing. When was the last time we laughed together? Lincoln felt his heart constrict, when indeed. The war had stolen so much from them, not just their son Willie, but years of joy, of companionship, of simple domestic happiness. And now, just as peace was returning, just as they might have had a chance to reclaim some of that lost happiness, it would all be taken away. I'm looking forward to it as well, he said, and this too was not entirely a lie. Despite the dread that filled him, he was grateful for this last opportunity to see Mary happy, to share an evening of normalcy with her before the darkness fell. Sat down to breakfast together, a simple meal of eggs and toast that Mary had persuaded the cook to prepare despite the early hour. As they ate, Mary chattered about her plans for the day, about the dress she would wear to the theater, about the people they might see there. Lincoln listened with only half his attention, the other half focused on memorizing these moments, storing them away like treasures against the long night that was coming. After breakfast, Lincoln retreated to his office where the usual mountain of paperwork awaited him. But for once, he found it difficult to concentrate on the mundane details of governance. His mind kept wandering to the dream, to the visions of the future he had been shown, to the weight of destiny that pressed down upon him like a physical force. He picked up his pen and began to write. Not official correspondence, but personal. Thoughts, reflections on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. The words flowed from his pen as if they had a life of their own. I have seen the future, and it is both terrible and wonderful. Terrible because of the struggles that lie ahead, the setbacks and disappointments that will test the nation's resolve. Wonderful because of the ultimate triumph of justice and equality that will emerge from these trials. I understand now that my role in this great drama is not to see its conclusion, but to provide the catalyst for its continuation. My death will serve where my life could not, inspiring others to take up the cause I have defended and carry it forward to victories I will never see. If this is to be my final day upon this earth, I pray that I will meet its end with courage and dignity. I pray that Mary will find the strength to carry on without me, that my sons will understand the necessity of my sacrifice, and that the nation will emerge from this tragedy stronger and more united than before. The burden of knowledge is heavy, but it is also liberating. I no longer need to fear the future, for I have seen it, and I know that the cause of freedom and justice will ultimately prevail. My death will be a small price to pay for so great a victory. Lincoln set down his pen and read over what he had written. The words surprised him with their calm acceptance, their lack of bitterness or despair. Perhaps the dream had accomplished more than he realized. Perhaps it had not only shown him the future, but had also given him the strength to face it. Knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called, hastily folding the letter and placing it in his desk drawer. His secretary, John Hay, entered with a stack of documents requiring his attention. "Good morning, Mr. President. I have the pardons you requested and several other matters that need your signature." Lincoln looked at the young man who had served him so faithfully throughout his presidency. Hay was intelligent, dedicated, and deeply loyal qualities that would serve him well in the years to come. After Lincoln's death, he would go on to serve as Secretary of State, helping to guide the nation through the challenges of the new century. "Thank you, John," Lincoln said, taking the documents. "I trust you are well this morning?" "Very well, sir." The mood in the city is quite jubilant. People are celebrating in the streets, singing songs, embracing strangers. It's as if the entire nation has awakened from a long nightmare. Lincoln nodded, signing the first document without really reading it. If only they knew that the nightmare was not over, that its final, most terrible chapter was yet to be written, but perhaps that was for the best. Let them have their moment of joy. Let them believe for a few precious hours that the worst was behind them. As he worked through the papers, Lincoln found himself studying each signature, each stroke of the pen. These would be among his last official acts as president. Tomorrow, Andrew Johnson would be taking the oath of office, inheriting a position he had never sought and responsibilities he was ill-equipped to handle. Lincoln felt a pang of worry for his vice president. Johnson was a good man, but he lacked the vision and flexibility that the coming years would require. The generous Reconstruction policies Lincoln had envisioned would likely be abandoned in favor of harsher measures that would create new divisions and resentments. It was another reason why Lincoln's death was necessary. His martyrdom would serve as a constant reminder of the principles that should guide the nation's healing. The morning passed slowly, each hour bringing him closer to the evening and his appointment with destiny. Lincoln found himself paying attention to small details he had previously overlooked, the way the light fell across his desk, the sound of carriages passing in the street, the familiar creaking of the old building settling on its foundations. At noon, Mary brought him lunch on a tray, insisting that he eat something substantial. "You've been working too hard," she scolded gently. "You need to keep up your strength." Lincoln smiled at her concern, so characteristic of their long marriage. She had always been a worrier, always concerned about his health and well-being. How would she survive without him? How would she cope with the sudden, violent end of their life together? "I am fine, Mary," he assured her, though the food tasted like ash in his mouth. "Just a bit preoccupied with all the work that needs to be done." "Well, it can wait," Mary said firmly. "Tonight, we are going to forget about work and politics and all the troubles of the world. We are going to laugh and enjoy ourselves like we used to do." Lincoln nodded, not trusting himself to speak. If only she knew how prophetic her words were. They would indeed forget about the troubles of the world, at least for a few hours. And then those troubles would return with a vengeance that would echo through history. Afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, cabinet members, senators, ordinary citizens seeking favors or simply wanting to shake the hand of the man who had saved the Union. Lincoln received them all with his characteristic patience and grace, but part of his mind remained focused on the evening ahead. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Lincoln felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The day had been good, filled with meaningful work and precious moments with Mary. If these were to be his last hours, at least they had been well spent. He stood at his office window, watching the sun disappear behind the buildings of Washington. Somewhere in the city, John Wilkes Booth was preparing for his moment of infamy, checking his pistol, rehearsing his escape route, steeling himself for the act that would make him one of history's most despised figures. Lincoln felt no anger toward his future assassin, only a profound sadness for the waste of it all. Booth was a talented actor, a man who could have contributed something positive to the world. Instead, he had chosen hatred and violence, and in doing so, had condemned himself to eternal infamy. But perhaps even Booth's actions served some greater purpose. Perhaps his crime was necessary to complete the transformation of Lincoln from president to martyr, from politician to saint. The mysterious figure in his dream had suggested as much, and Lincoln was beginning to understand the terrible logic of it all. As the last light faded from the sky, Lincoln heard Mary's voice calling from upstairs. "Abraham, it's time to get ready for the theater." Lincoln took one last look at his office, at the papers scattered across his desk, at the portrait of George Washington hanging on the wall. Then he turned and walked toward the stairs, toward Mary, toward the theater, toward his destiny. Night was waiting for him, and with it, the final chapter of his earthly story. But Lincoln was no longer afraid. He had seen the future, and he knew that his death would serve a purpose greater than his life. The seeds of justice and equality that he had planted would grow and flourish, nourished by the blood of martyrdom. As he climbed the stairs to join his wife, Abraham Lincoln felt a strange kind of peace. He was ready for whatever the night might bring. Chapter 5. The final hours. The bedroom was awash in warm lamplight as Lincoln entered to find Mary putting the finishing touches on her evening toilette. She stood before the mirror in her finest gown, a burgundy silk dress with delicate lace trim that he had always admired on her. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant chignon, and she wore the pearl necklace he had given her on their wedding anniversary years ago. "You look beautiful, my dear," Lincoln said, and he meant it. In the soft light, Mary seemed to glow with happiness and anticipation. The years of war and worry had taken their toll on her, but tonight she looked younger, more like the spirited woman he had married more than 2 decades ago. Mary turned from the mirror, her eyes bright with pleasure. "Do you really think so? I want to look my best tonight. It feels like we're celebrating, doesn't it? The end of this terrible war, the beginning of peace." Lincoln nodded, his throat tight with emotion. If only she knew how short-lived this peace would be, how quickly celebration would turn to mourning. But he pushed these dark thoughts aside. Tonight was for Mary, for her joy, for the happiness she deserved after years of sacrifice and worry. "Indeed it does," he agreed, moving to his wardrobe to select his own evening clothes. "We have much to celebrate." As he dressed, Lincoln found himself moving more slowly than usual, savoring each familiar action. The feel of the starched collar around his neck, the weight of his watch chain across his vest, the way his tall frame looked in the mirror, all of it seemed precious now, worthy of attention and remembrance. Mary bustled about the room, checking her appearance one final time, gathering her gloves and fan. Her excitement was infectious, and despite the weight of knowledge he carried, Lincoln found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. "I do hope the play is amusing," Mary said, settling her evening cape around her shoulders. "We haven't laughed together in so long, Abraham. I've almost forgotten what it feels like." Lincoln helped her with the cape, his hands lingering on her shoulders for a moment longer than necessary. "Then we shall make up for lost time tonight," he said softly. "We shall laugh until our sides ache." The irony of his words was not lost on him. By tomorrow, Mary would be weeping as she had never wept before. But tonight they would laugh together, one last time. A knock at the door announced the arrival of their carriage. "The theater awaits, Mrs. Lincoln," he said, offering her his arm with a courtly bow that made her giggle like a young girl. As they descended the stairs together, Lincoln caught sight of his reflection in the hall mirror. He looked distinguished in his evening clothes, every inch the successful president and devoted husband. No one looking at him would guess that he carried the weight of prophecy in his heart, that he knew this night would be his last. The April air was mild and pleasant. As they stepped outside, the carriage waited in the circular drive, its lanterns glowing warmly in the darkness. Lincoln helped Mary up into the vehicle, then settled beside her as the driver urged the horses forward. As they rolled through the streets of Washington, Lincoln found himself studying the familiar sights with new eyes. The gas lamps flickering along the avenues, the couples strolling arm in arm, the tavern spilling light and laughter into the darkness, all of it seemed to pulse with life and possibility. The war was over and the city was celebrating. "Look how happy everyone seems," Mary observed, pressing her face to the carriage window. "It's as if the whole world has been reborn." Lincoln nodded, though his own thoughts were more complex. "Yes, The war was over, but the work of reconstruction had barely begun. The challenges ahead, integrating the freed slaves, rebuilding the South, healing the nation's wounds, would require wisdom, patience, and moral courage. And he would not be there to guide the process, the thought of Andrew Johnson assuming. The presidency filled Lincoln with unease. Johnson was a decent man, but he lacked the vision and flexibility that the coming years would require. The generous policies Lincoln had envisioned would likely be abandoned in favor of harsher measures that would create new divisions and resentments. But perhaps that too was part of the greater design. Perhaps Lincoln's death was necessary not just to inspire future generations, but to ensure that the cause of justice and equality would have martyrs to rally around. A living president could be criticized, opposed, voted out of office. A martyred president became a symbol, a standard by which all future leaders would be measured. The carriage turned onto 10th Street, and Lincoln could see the facade of Ford's theater ahead, its windows blazing with light. A crowd had gathered outside, drawn by the news that the president and Mrs. Lincoln would be attending the performance. As their carriage approached, people began to cheer and wave, calling out greetings. "And congratulations. They love you," Mary said, squeezing his hand. "They're grateful for what you've done." Lincoln smiled and waved back, but his heart was heavy. How would these same people react tomorrow when they learned of his fate? How would their cheers turn to wails of grief? How would their celebration become lamentation? The carriage pulled up to the theater entrance, and Lincoln stepped down first, then turned to help Mary alight. She moved with grace and dignity, every inch the president's wife. As they walked toward the entrance, the crowd pressed closer, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had saved the Union. "God bless you, Mr. President," called out a voice from the crowd. "Thank you for ending the war," shouted another. Lincoln nodded and waved, but found himself scanning the faces in the crowd. Was John Wilkes Booth among them? Was he already in the theater, checking his pistol, preparing for his moment of infamy? The thought sent a chill down Lincoln's spine, but he maintained his composure. Inside the theater, the atmosphere was festive. Well-dressed patrons filled the lobby, their voices raised in animated conversation about the end of the war. Lincoln recognized many faces: senators, cabinet members, prominent citizens of Washington. They all seemed to radiate the same joy and relief that he had seen in Mary's face. The theater manager, James Ford, approached with obvious delight. "Mr. President, Mrs. Lincoln, what an honor to have you here tonight. The box is ready for you, sir." Lincoln nodded his thanks, though his eyes were already moving to the presidential box high above the stage. The red velvet chairs, the gold trim, the American flag draped over the railing. It was exactly as he had seen it in his dream. In just a few hours, that elegant box would become the scene of national tragedy. As they made their way to the box, Lincoln found himself studying the theater's layout. The narrow staircase leading to the box, the door that Booth would enter through, the distance to the stage where the assassin would make his escape, all of it was burned into his memory from his prophetic dream. Mary settled into her chair with obvious pleasure, arranging her skirts carefully and opening her fan. "Oh, Abraham, isn't this lovely? We should do this more often." Lincoln sat beside her, his tall frame somewhat awkward in the theater chair. "Yes," he agreed, "we should." But even as he spoke the words, he knew there would be no more evenings like this, no more shared laughter, no more simple pleasures enjoyed together. The orchestra began to play, and the curtain rose on the first act of Our American Cousin. The play was indeed amusing, a light comedy about the adventures of an American rustic visiting his aristocratic English relatives. The audience laughed at the witty dialogue and absurd situations, and Lincoln found himself Drawn into the performance despite his preoccupation with darker matters, Mary laughed delightedly at the comic mishaps on stage, her face radiant with joy. She reached over and squeezed Lincoln's hand, and he felt a surge of protective tenderness for her. How innocent she was, how trusting, how completely unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold. As the first act progressed, Lincoln found himself relaxing slightly. The play was genuinely funny, and Mary's enjoyment was infectious. Perhaps he could allow himself this one last evening of normalcy, this final respite before the storm broke. During the intermission, several friends stopped by their box to pay their respects. General and Mrs. Grant had been invited to join them, but had declined at the last minute, choosing instead to visit their children in New Jersey. Lincoln wondered if this too was part of the design, if Grant's absence was necessary to ensure that the evening would unfold as it had been prophesied. Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Miss Clara Harris, had been invited to accompany them instead. They were pleasant young people, full of excitement about their upcoming wedding and the bright future that seemed to lie ahead. Lincoln watched them with a mixture of fondness and sorrow, knowing that their evening of celebration would soon become a nightmare they would carry for the rest of their lives. "Are you enjoying the performance, Mr. President?" asked Major Rathbone during the intermission. "Very much," Lincoln replied. "It's exactly what Mary and I needed, a chance to laugh together." The Major smiled. "You both deserve some happiness after all you've been through. The country owes you a debt that can never be repaid." Lincoln nodded, though he thought grimly that the debt would be paid in full before the night was over. His death would be the final payment, the ultimate sacrifice that would purchase the nation's redemption. As the second act began, Lincoln found his attention wandering from the stage. He kept glancing at the door to the box, expecting at any moment to see it open and admit his assassin. The dream had been so vivid, so detailed, that he felt as if he were simply waiting for it to come true. The play continued, building toward its climax. Lincoln tried to focus on the performance, to give Mary this one last evening of shared pleasure. She was laughing at something happening on stage, her face animated with delight. He memorized the sound of her laughter, storing it away like a treasure. As the third act began, Lincoln felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The waiting was almost over. Soon, the prophecy would be fulfilled, and he would take his place among the martyrs of history. The thought no longer frightened him as it had earlier. Instead, he felt a kind of solemn acceptance, a readiness to complete the role he had been given to play. The famous line was approaching, the moment when the character Asa Trenchard would deliver the line that would provide cover for the assassin's shot. Lincoln had heard the line in his dream, and now he waited for it in reality, knowing that it would be among the last words he would ever hear. On stage, the actor playing Asa Trenchard was building toward his big moment. The setup was perfect. The character's pompous mother-in-law had just left the stage, and he was about to deliver the line that would bring down the house with laughter. "Don't know the manners of good society, the actor declaimed. "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out. Old gal you, sockdologizing old man trap." The audience erupted in laughter, just as Lincoln had known they would. The sound filled the theater, masking any other noise that might occur. It was the perfect moment for an assassin to strike. Lincoln turned slightly in his chair, some instinct warning him of approaching danger. In the dim light at the back of the box, he could see the door opening slowly, silently. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall, dark-haired, handsome in a theatrical way. John Wilkes Booth. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Lincoln looked into the eyes of his assassin and saw there a mixture of hatred, madness, and something that might have been regret. Booth raised his pistol, His hand steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. Lincoln felt a strange calm descend upon him. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the culmination of his prophetic dream. He thought of Mary, sitting beside him in blissful ignorance. He thought of the nation he had served, the principles he had defended, the future he had been. Shown in his vision, the pistol fired. The sound was loud despite the audience's laughter, a sharp crack that seemed to echo through eternity. Lincoln felt the bullet strike him, felt his body slump forward in the chair. But strangely, there was no pain, only a sense of completion, of a job well done. As consciousness began to fade, Lincoln heard Mary scream, saw Major Rathbone grappling with the assassin, felt the chaos erupting around him. But these earthly concerns seemed distant now, unimportant compared to the greater truth he had been shown. His sacrifice was complete. The seed had been planted. The long harvest of justice and equality could now begin. In his last moments of awareness, Abraham Lincoln thought he heard once again the phantom, music that had haunted his dreams, but now it was not mournful or ominous. Instead, it was triumphant, a victory song that seemed to celebrate not his death, but his transformation from mortal man to immortal symbol. The music grew louder, more beautiful, as Lincoln felt himself being lifted beyond the confines of his broken body, beyond the chaos of the future, beyond the boundaries of time and space. He was free now, free to become what he had always been meant to be, not just a president, but a martyr, a saint, a beacon of hope for all who would come after Dodd. And in that freedom, Abraham Lincoln finally understood the full meaning of his Eerie dream. His death was not an ending, but a beginning, not a tragedy, but a triumph, not a failure, but the ultimate success.